Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. I have a beautiful panel, just so many. You've read their books, but now they're actually here on the show. And we're going to talk about a topic that I think deserves lots more attention, and that is solfeggio. As you know, Partimento revolution is just going really flowering, and everyone's picking up Partimento. Now let's add the other side of the coin, which is the other part of the vital training that they had at the Neapolitan Conservatory. So I'd like to welcome Professor Nicholas Baragwanath, Professor Joop IJzerman, Professor Peter Van Toor, and Professor Bob Gjerdingen. Hello, everyone. How is everyone doing?
Hey, Nikhil, doing well.
Great. And it would be inconceivable that no one knows who you are, but maybe for the new people who come into this movement, maybe why don't everyone just give yourself a quick introduction? Professor Baragwanath, why don't you just give a brief introduction?
Okay. I trained as a pianist, a solo pianist for some years, and worked in opera houses and was a performing musician for a while. Then I went into academia. I've published on quite a few things, but the reason I'm here today is my recent book, which is on solfeggio, on primarily Italian school of solfeggio in the 18th century.
Great. Professor IJzerman.
Yes, my background is a pianist too, and I did a lot of classical and traditional music theory. But some 8 or 10 years ago, I started to deepen myself into the early music scene, and I'm doing a lot of Renaissance music. But of course, also I read the books of Bob and Nicholas and Peter with a lot of interest. And as a sort of outcome, I have written my own book, Harmony Counterpoint Partimento.
Wonderful. Professor Van Toor?
Absolutely. So my background is I am trained as a music teacher, and I have been doing research in Partimento the last 10 years or so. And at the moment, I'm teaching at Örebro University in Sweden.
Great, great. And Professor Gjerdingen, why don't you introduce yourself?
Well, I've been around for a long time and have done a lot of crazy things, like being in an army band in Hawaii and playing in awful churches and all kinds of things at the lower level of performing music. But I found I did have some talent in scholarship. And so I became very interested in music psychology and the idea of if you were a working musician in past centuries, how did you know what to say? If you can think of music, performing music, especially improvising music as a kind of speech that you're saying something, well, how did you know what to say? And how did you know that what you said was correct or at least acceptable or ideally entertaining? So I studied the phrases of classical music for a long time. And then it was just like a bolt out of the blue when one of my colleagues introduced me to Partimenti. And I saw that these teachers, the masters at the conservatories, were teaching the children what to say. It may seem obvious, but if you're going to be a blues guitarist, somebody has to teach you what to say. Now, maybe you get it from recordings today, but in an era before recordings, some human had to tell you what to do, or at least imitate. You could imitate a master. So even if they couldn't speak at all, they could speak music and you could imitate them. So I became very interested in that. And Partimenti fit into that as a kind of historical testament of how masters trained young musicians. And then, of course, I just found this stuff completely engaging. And I was suddenly able to improvise myself, which surprised everyone. And I have to, full disclosure, I'm an adagio improviser. If I try and improvise at a fast tempo, I completely lose track of what I'm doing. But the idea that I could do it at all is just amazing, because I'm a mediocre musician on my best days, but I'm a local hero now. I can improvise in the church organ. I mean, this is very small time stuff compared to what some of my colleagues here are able to do. But nonetheless, it was fun to be involved in bringing dusty scholarship to a point where it could be useful. And well, the young prodigy Alma Deutscher that I helped when she was quite young, is now a big time composer and conductor, and it's amazing what this stuff can do. Not surprising in a way, because after all, this is how this music was taught when it really mattered.
Right. That's a good launching point for our topic today, which is solfeggio. I think it would be fun actually to can each of you just talk about how you got introduced to solfeggio? I know the book, Professor Gjerdingen, in our conversations we talked about the researchers in the past, Fellera, I think, and there's some musicologists in the 20th century. But let's talk about solfeggio now. How did each of you get interested in the Neapolitan approach to solfeggio? Maybe we'll go in reverse. Professor Van Toor, why don't you talk about your introduction to solfeggio?
Yeah, well, when I started to write about Partimento, of course, I bumped into solfeggio, and it was intriguing to see that the modern composers in Partimento were the old-fashioned ones for the solfeggio, and vice versa, which was a bit surprising. And I didn't really understand that from the beginning. Durante was very modern in his approach to Partimento, but he was quite old-fashioned in his solfeggio approach. And Leonardo Leo was quite old-fashioned with his solfeggi, no, in his partimenti, and he was quite modern with his solfeggi. So it raised a lot of questions that took a while to figure out why that was.
Professor IJzerman, how about you?
Yes, my first steps in historical solfeggio was hexachord solmization in the field of Renaissance music, and that's already a long time ago. And I found it very interesting because hexachord solmization says something about the structure of the melodies of that style. Many years later, I heard Nick talking about the Italian solfeggio tradition. I think it was in Leuven. Is that possible, Nick? I think so.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Yes.
I was a sort of flabbergasted because at first I didn't understand anything of that. But I had the idea that it was something really meaningful. And a couple of years later, I started to try to understand the whole system. And I experimented a lot with my students. And also to my own surprise, students just took it up very clearly. And they told me that it was very meaningful to them. And they really had the idea that they understood at least the musical style of the 18th century. So yeah, that was a little bit my history with the solfeggio in this context.
Great. Professor Baragwanath, you wrote the very important solfeggio tradition. How did it start for you?
It's all Bob's fault. I blame him. It was actually in the year 2007. I first met Bob in Freiburg. There was a conference there. It was a very important conference because I remember Bob's book on the Galant style had just come out, and there was a real buzz. Everyone was there to hear about these strange things called partimento, And at that time, I have to confess, I had never heard the word. I didn't know what a partimento was in 2007. And it was all very new to me. And I wasn't even a scholar in this field. I was in a completely different field. And it was Bob's book, which has a chapter on solfeggio. And I think Bob needs credit there for being the first modern scholar to actually take an interest in this topic. So Bob's chapter on, I think you call it do, re, mi, Bob. Is that right? And when I read that, and I became aware that there were thousands, 12,000 of these manuscripts all over the world. And no one had ever really studied them. No one had written about them. And then Bob came along and said, well, they had this different system. The semitone was always mi, fa. And I thought, that's fundamental. That's absolutely, foundational to the study of this music, but no one talks about it. So thanks to Bob, I set myself the task of trying to explain what all these manuscripts did, how they were used, how they were taught, because actually nobody really knew. And there's still, I have to say, a lot of things we still don't know. And I spent the next sort of 10 years studying, and I have to confess that for about 7 or 8 of those years, I really couldn't crack this thing at all. I just was going nowhere. I just analyzed these things to death. I tried every possible approach, and I just couldn't break this. I just couldn't understand, the way these things worked and how they were used. And then sort of things started to fall into place, and I won't talk in detail about that, but just, it started to click. And then I realized a few things, and it all made sense. It's all Bob's fault, and he set me on a path for about 10 years of digging around archives all over the place, trying to find these sources, and plowing through difficult manuscripts and teaching myself all sorts of new skills. I blame him.
Well, you were mentioned, Professor Gjerdingen. Why did you talk about solfeggio for you? You mentioned music in the Galant style. It was mentioned.
Well, there's 2 phases of this for me. The very first was that I managed to get to be 18 with practically no musical training except for piano lessons. I'm not proud of that, but I came from a village of 300 people, and I didn't get to hear a symphony orchestra until I was 16. This was really rural life in an agricultural area. So I got to college, and I had studied harmony books, Roman numerals and all that good stuff. I was so good at it that the teacher of the harmony class was a recent graduate from the Juilliard School. He went on to become the first violist of the Cleveland Orchestra. So he was a great musician. But he hated teaching harmony. So he said, if you teach this damn course for me, I'll pay for your solfeggio lessons. I didn't know what that was exactly, but it sounded like a deal. I was 18 years old. What could I lose? So once a week, I got on my bicycle. Well, I would teach this harmony class, and then I would get on my bicycle, and I would bicycle. This is down in Florida. I would bicycle to the house of a man who had retired as a bassist for the Boston Symphony. At one point, he had been the principal bassist of the Chicago Symphony. He had won a second prize in solfege before the First World War. So this was definitely old school. I remember we started with whole notes, and he was appalled by my pronunciation. He was completely French. His name was Gaston Dufresne. He said, it's do, fa, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do. And then I would say soul, like rhythm and blues, like soul. and he would say, soul, what is this? Anyway, he would have me sing a C, a whole note on C, and I had to conduct like this: 1, 2, 3, 4. And I realized that this was an amazingly old tradition, rich tradition. I left that college. I left him after a year, and to my, tremendous regret. But that was when I was exposed to old school solfege in its glory. I was completely unworthy, but I realized this was the introduction to music literacy, to music performance, to the whole thing. At the Paris Conservatory, solfege was everything, and then you specialize. Okay, so phase two. Okay, I'm quite a bit older, and I'm in a musicology program at the University of Pennsylvania, and I have to pass the musicology general exam. So I did a couple years of studying early music. And what I realized was that no one was issued little flags that said, the Renaissance is over, or the Baroque is over. If you were a provincial musician in a town in Italy, you kept doing exactly what your teacher did forever. You never had a flag that said, oh, Baroque is over. Now it's all classical. It's all different now. Now it's 4 chords and 5 chords. All right. They didn't issue those flags. No one could get them. So you did exactly what your teacher did. If you think of instrumental instruction, it's always been that way. There are pianists today who are 7 generations removed from Beethoven. And I'm guessing that Beethoven probably taught just like somebody today's teacher taught. That there's not like radical changes. It's very incremental. And so I presumed that the children at these conservatories learn music in the same way that, well, in Naples, there's a famous theorist named Cerrone. And he wrote just a little bit after Palestrina. I don't think things changed very much from Cerrone to somebody in Mozart's time like Fenaroli. There's no evidence of a big change. Everything that Cerrone believed in and loved, I believe that Fenaroli believed in and loved. And nobody talked about any kind of cataclysmic change. So that's my second take on this, that coming from a kind of early musicology background, looking at these pieces, they look very much like the great Palestrina tradition, the great Italian sacred music tradition. And of course, these institutions were funded by the church. So really, no one had an interest in radical change. These institutions, I would say, were primarily for tradition keeping and tradition enriching.
Can I ask a question? So surely, I mean, in most modern conservatories, everyone does solfeggio. There's a class, ear training. So just for people who are curious, like, wait a second, we already do solfeggio. So why is this any different from what I'm doing? So maybe Professor IJzerman, what is the difference perhaps with the Neapolitan approach that you can contrast with a modern conservatory today?
Yes. Now, I worked until some 2 or 3 weeks ago on the Conservatory of Amsterdam, and I'm now retiring. But we had a lot of
congratulations!
Congratulations!
Let's have a party.
I feel very free at the very moment.
We'll make
but yeah. Anyway. So we have a lot of students from French, Spanish, Portuguese-speaking countries, and they were all educated in the so-called fixed do. And actually, I hate that system for several reasons. One of the reasons is that it doesn't have any musical meaning. So if you say do or re, it can mean everything, actually. So the do is the C or the C flat or the C sharp. It can be part of C major, but also part of A flat major, and so forth and so forth. So those solmization syllables are only saying something about the pitch. And I think music is not about pitches, but it is about pitch relations. And fixed do doesn't teach you anything in those relations. The point is that when you are trained very toughly in that system, then you develop a kind of absolute pitch ear, which is admired by many people. But I think that it doesn't help you to be a better musician. And on some moment, for instance, when you are listening to a piece by Vivaldi, for instance, in a tuning of 415, those people are completely lost. Because it doesn't fit with their drilling system of the fixed do. So I always favored the movable do. Let's say the Kodai system. It's much more than just a movable do, solfeggio. It's a whole philosophy about music. But a few years ago, I just decided to give up, and because it was a sort of struggle that I was always losing to try to learn to teach Spanish or French students in the movable do. It was terrible. So I decided to stop with that. But at that very moment, they stopped learning anything. So I didn't see any development anymore. At the same time, I learned about the Italian solfeggio method, and as I already said before, I was already educated and trained in the hexachordal system of the Renaissance. And some 8 or 9 years ago, I started to teach on our early music department. And I thought, this is a big chance, because they all came from fixed do countries, everybody. And I had to teach them something of historical solfeggio. It's a bit anachronistic because solfeggio is of later day than the solfeggio of the Renaissance, of course. But anyway, it was called historical solfeggio. And I thought this is a good chance to introduce to them the hexachord system for several reasons. First of all, it was an old system, and they were old musicians, so that's good. Yeah? So that was a bit of a trick, a pedagogical trick. On the other hand, the hexachord system is partly covering the fixed do, because the hexachord naturale, starting on C, is exactly the ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la of the French. So partly they could recognize the system. And I started with that, and it was a big success, actually, because everybody loved it, and a lot of very positive evaluations. So that was for me the start to develop, first of all, the Renaissance system. But then Nick came on with his book, and with his talk already a few years before. And I thought that's a big chance to also use the system in later styles. So at the very moment that the book came out, or already even before, I started my classes with that. And to my own surprise, and my students were very enthusiastic. And I got comments of them that they learned for the first time in their life something meaningful in a theory class. So, and I think, in a way, I understand them, because when you talk about, now let's not talk anymore about the fixed do system, but when you talk, for instance, about Roman numerals, making music to some sort of chord progression, I always compare it with the salami sauces, with some slices of chords. That has not so much to do, I think, with music. But when you approach music in a more horizontal way, of course, which is solfeggio, or that old solfeggio system, the hexachord system, it is all about relations, it's all about horizontality. And together with with Bob's fantastic theory about the schemas. It offered a fantastic tool to think in terms of music in a very horizontal way. Just to end my what I want to say is, when you are a pianist or an organist, you are a sort of used to think in terms of chords. I remember that when I was 7 or 8 years old, I really liked to play chords, and I liked to accompany myself when I was singing a little tune or something like that. But for violin players or trombone players or whatever players, chords is something abstract, and they think in terms of melody. And so I think that this is one of the things that is so important, and why maybe my students found it so important and so meaningful to learn it in that way.
Right. Professor Van Troy, you have a lot of experience in the classroom, and you. I also want to talk about the Solfeggio database, which has been very useful for researchers. Can you speak about Solfeggio in the classroom and your approach to it, getting meaningful results from Solfeggio, like how those Neapolitans did in the 18th century?
Yeah, well, I have kind of two hats here. And on the one hand, as a researcher, I'm very interested in figuring out how solfeggio worked in relation to partimento and to counterpoint. As a teacher of music theory, what shall I say? I see a lot of problems around me in the conservatories, where many students come with quite advanced skills in melodic and rhythmic reading. The reading skills are usually quite good when they come, even if it has to be polished. But the harmonic skills are usually very poor. So there is this gap between the melodic and the rhythmic training, and then the I could see the lack of training in the harmonic part, and that's the same for counterpoint. Most students have no experience at all in counterpoint. So as a teacher, I'm faced with a problem. So the limited amount of time that I have to spend on my classes, how should I use it to make them aware of things that they don't know? And in that situation, I tend to downplay the melodic part of solfeggio, just because they already have quite good skills there. The first thing I want to do is I want to give them experience to put their hands on the keyboard. Modern flute players or violin players, they've never approached or at least many of them have never approached the piano. So they're only working with their instrument, and it makes them completely focused on the sound quality of their instrument. They're very focused on that, and they put lots of time into that. And they're working on rhythmic skills and harmonic skills and a lot of reading skills, but they work very little with what the accompanist is doing or understanding the music they are playing. So the whole understanding part of their musicianship has to be built from scratch, I would say, in most cases. So, and in this situation, I think partimento has been a revelation for me, because it has shown me that the limited amount of time that I have as a theory teacher becomes so much more efficient by making my students learn with their hands instead of learning through a blackboard or a whiteboard. So the learning becomes faster. So my approach to partimento is more central than my approach to solfeggio, I would say. So, and if you ask me, so what do you do with the solfeggi? I would say I use them for the material of the solfeggi. If you look at the solfeggi, how they are built, and the patterns that are in these pieces, there are lots of schematic things that are extremely useful for building skills in counterpoint or building skills in canons, that kind of thing. So I use the materials, but I don't put a lot of time into solmization. Um, and as a historian, I can say there were also back in the days of the 18th century, there were teachers were complaining about doing solfeggio too there. I remember reading about Nicola Porpora, who didn't use any solmization at all. So he put a lot of time into counterpoint and into understanding the music, but he was more interested in working with the voice than doing the solmization stuff. So that makes me a little bit of a skeptical in the field of solmization, I would say.
Well, it's good to have your input on the panel. Professor Baragwanath, I'd really love to get your take on your classroom experience now with solfeggio, with solmization, and how have you seen the reaction to your work in the classroom, like kind of like Professor IJzerman was talking about?
Well, actually, I think Jorb is probably better suited to answer this question because he has more experience of teaching. I mean, I have taught many courses on this, but not a huge amount. And actually, I think it depends what you want to do. I mean, a lot of people do ask. They say, "Well, okay, we've got this system from the past. What do we do with it? How can it be of use nowadays?" Well, my answer to that is, well, it depends what you want to do. So, for instance, some musicologists like to analyze music, so they like to be able to describe music of the past. And it's quite useful for that. You can look at schemata, and you can find all sorts of interesting patterns by looking at the syllables and how they're used. Other people use it for improvisation. So I do know of some professional musicians who now use this system, so especially singers and early music performance and so on. If you're, for instance, embellishing a da capo of an aria, a good friend of mine, Stefano Aresi in Amsterdam, he says that before he started using solfeggio, he said it would take them around 70% longer to add ornaments to a da capo in an aria. And once you know the solfeggio and you can see the patterns, it's much, much easier. I find it gives performers more confidence. Once they understand the underlying pattern, then they have more confidence in adapting it and putting it to their own voice. And similarly, solfeggio can be used for stylistic knowledge, so for improvisation and composition, for instance. So I've taught pastiche composition, so writing in an 18th century style, including counterpoint. And solfeggio is incredibly useful for this because you learn melody-bass pairings. You start to understand melody-bass pairings very much better. And actually, who was it who said this? Someone earlier, I think it was Bob said this, that he started to be able to improvise, by using these systems. Well, if you study solfeggio, melodic improvisation becomes a lot easier. But there are many aspects to it which are not well understood and have not been written about. So, for instance, the rhythmic aspect of solfeggio and how rhythm is applied to these schemata, these patterns of syllables, is quite a complex business. And no one's so far written about that or tried to understand that. And it's actually crucial to improvisation. So it's if you give a student a string of syllables and say, well, make me a melody, the question arises, well, what's my rhythm? How do I put rhythm to these syllables? And so that's quite an important point which needs a bit more attention. But just to quickly answer the question then, I found that my experience is similar to Jorb's in that students have really taken to this enthusiastically. At the start, they found it really odd, really strange, that there's a system that they're completely unfamiliar with. But they very quickly pick up. The one thing that no one so far has really picked up on is what I thought was quite an important insight in my book, which is how they read music. And they actually read music through two simple systems. So they could read any key or any clef using just 2 simple patterns, which is pretty amazing. And so for them, do, re, mi, fa, sol was not just a simple intervallic shape. It was also a way to read music in any key or any clef. And it always amazed me, when you look back in the 18th century, you'd find manuscripts with sort of 4 different clefs, and they would chop and change between clefs all over the place, in a way that even the best modern solfege trained student, would have trouble with. And of course, they weren't reading in the same way as us. For them, the fa clefs, finding mi fa on a stave, there's only 2 places it can go. It's either on a line or a space. And so it radically simplifies the process of reading. But so far, I seem to be the only person who does this. So, reading, because in order to do it, you have to sort of learn plain chant, you have to go back to basics. And I suppose it can actually damage your ability to read in a modern way, when G clefs and F clef and pianos and so on. That's one thing that students have found very difficult. But there are various other things that they find quite easy. So creating melodies out of strings of syllables and analyzing them, I found students to be pretty good, actually. So with a little bit of training, students can do as much as I can do with a melody. They can spot these syllables, they can spot the patterns and so on. Yeah, I hope that's an answer. But as I say, Job's had more classroom experience than me in teaching this.
Right. There's a question that people who are into Partimento want to ask, which is, do I need to be a good singer? Do I need to do a solfeggio, no matter the system? Do I need to sing to be realizing Partimenti well? Is this a necessary thing? Clearly, historically, it was. But what would the panel say about it today? Is it a requirement? Would you want your students who are learning Partimento to sing and to do solfeggio? Anyone can take it.
I would say absolutely. Singing is foundational for musicianship of all times. I think the singing helps us to become aware of so many things, so the solmization is, I think, a different thing, a different aspect of solfeggio than the actual melodies or the singing in itself. So you can very well have a foundation of singing pedagogy in your teaching without applying these various systems of solmization. One of the problems I experience is that there are so many systems. Job already talked about this with many of the southern European countries that have their own system, and there's always struggle between these systems, and it's very annoying. So what do you do with it? So there's always 1 or 2 in the classroom that get annoyed when you pick one system, then
Right. Professor Gjerdingen, what to that point? Do I have to sing lots of melodies to will this be useful for Partimento?
Whether you sing them or play them, you should study lots of them. And I think one of the, I'm not a big fan of the so-called sight singing classes in American universities. I think they're almost universally awful. And the only schools in which they are really well done, the teachers tend to be tyrants. And it's a brutal thing. I mean, I monitored a class at a well-known conservatory where somebody flubbed the syllables and was sent to the corner of the classroom to practice while everybody else. I mean, it's just short of giving a dunce cap to somebody. A couple basic things. The fluent solmizers that Job referred to from Spain and Italy and France, learned these things when they were quite young. And so in terms of a language, this is what would be called F1, your native language. And it should be remembered that historically solfège was training in musical literacy. Now, it could extend to training in vocal technique, but oftentimes those exercises had different names, the gorgeggi and things like that. They were for professional singers. But it really was training in musical literacy, and you learned a first language. And it was foundational then because you could talk about music and the students would know what you meant. Now, whether that was using the Guidonian hand, or not, I mean, there's all ways to achieve that, but it's a first language. Now, in a university setting, today you have an 18-year-old, and you're basically teaching them a second language. But frankly, you're not going to give them what they need to learn the second language. You're going to assign them a solfège. They will sing it poorly, out of tune, and with the wrong syllables in all the important places. And then you will move on to the next exercise. And you will do that for 2 years. The student will pass the course and you'll declare victory. But it's an awful result. I mean, any conservatory in North America, if you walk by a class in sight singing, you will hear what sounds like a really bad chorus with about half the people sharp and about half the people flat, and all of them trying to figure out whether it's do or sol or mi. And of course, then add in what I call the fee, fi, fo, fum system, where you not only are supposed to say what scale degree it is, but whether it's flat or sharp or whatever. I mean, a beauty of the old Italian system was it worked perfectly for Palestrina, and it works perfectly for Webern. Okay, if you try it. It doesn't pretend to know what every note means at every minute. Even Féti, the mid-19th century French theorist who claimed to have invented tonality. He really did. He said he had this sort of Saul of Tarsus moment where he said all the false doctrines fell in shreds round about me as the truth of tonality shone through. So anyway, he said that during sequences he completely lost track of what the key was, and then it would emerge on the other end of the sequence. And maybe musicians have had this experience with Bach, with sequences in Bach, where he gets in one key and then he'll shift it on as you just take a little half step here or there and it moves it along. It's interesting that Féti said that really he was an advocate of partimenti. And he said, harmony, it only took about 6 weeks to teach harmony, what the subject was. But learning to make harmony then took much longer. I was struck by Nick talking about how simple some of these things are when you really get into them. And, in the French conservatory, they were quite open about this. I think it's a stunning fact that the only stable sonorities are 1, 3, 5 and 1, 6. That is harmony. That's it. That's the total subject. Now, you can make it more complicated by introducing counterpoint. You can make it more complicated by introducing schemas and try and study the sequence of things. But the actual core is really simple. What solfège in the past had in its favor was the richness of the study. Can we do screen sharing?
We can, yeah. What would you like to show?
I would like to show an example from Cherubini. This would be in probably the 1840s.
Okay, just tell me what it is. I'll find it.
Okay, it's IMS Help It's the Solfège du Conservatoire by Baptiste.
Okay, I'll try and look for it.
Book 4, first page. And I'll just talk while you're looking.
Okay.
But what you're going to find is the first page that has a theme. It's solfège, and I should emphasize that in Naples and Paris, solfeggi were accompanied. The master played the harmonies, so you always heard melodies in a harmonic context. Okay. If you think of a language class, you have endless exercises that say, in whatever language you're trying to learn, something like, I went to town and saw a man. And then you say, I went to town and saw a woman. And then you say, I went to town and saw a house. And so you learn these things to such an extent that you become automatic. And you can say, I went to town and saw a car, right? Those kind of exercises with substitutions, you learn a construction and you learn substitutions in it. In the Neapolitan and French way of thinking, this was variation. And as you learn a construction and then you learn to vary it, and in a way that teaches melodic analysis. I mean, Nick has done amazing work in showing how, in a sense, Neapolitan solfeggio was a kind of ongoing melodic analysis. In other words, you could simplify what was written by singing a one syllable to a more complicated pattern, right?
Well, why don't I let it load, and why don't we go to some questions that the audience kind of prepared, and then while this is loading, Professor Gjerdingen, we can come back to that. So,
in case we never get there, let me just finish it off by saying,
okay,
it's about a 12-measure theme. The theme has a double cadence in it. It has a opening sort of Baragwanath pattern. Then it has a monte. Then it has a cadence. And it is followed by 40 pages of variations. When you finish those 40 pages, having sung the melody and having that same accompaniment played actually 57 times, you know these patterns. So that's the beauty of the old kind of solfège, where it wasn't enough just to pass the course. You were expected to internalize this stuff. So anyway, that's enough. And please go on.
I'll just try and keep loading it now. So let's just get to the audience questions now. So the first question I have is from Olga. Olga, what is the main purpose of hexachordal solfège? And I think Professor Baragwanath, you talked about this a little bit. Why can't we just use fixed dose system, which Professor IJzerman, you mentioned many students in Europe do. When French conservatories continue the Italian tradition, why do they change to fixed dose? Is it necessary for students today to learn these old systems? Maybe Professor Baragwanath, why don't you take that one?
There's a lot of questions in there, but there's no should or must about this. I mean, essentially, I can only speak for myself, and my research I consider fundamentally historical. And so my job, as I saw it, was to bring some of this information to light and to try to interpret some of the things that happened in the past. And I've done the best job I could, but I completely admit that there are gaps and there are things we still need to study and understand. So there's no must about it. We have to remember that the modern system, so this person's, Olga, hello Olga, she's writing in saying, why can't we just use fixed dose? Well, you can, because if you're wanting to be, for instance, I'll just say this, like the other day, I went onto YouTube and just out of interest, I listened to the Warsaw Chopin piano competition. I listened to several rounds of that. I like to do that sometimes. And I was absolutely astonished that the 2023 competition sounds identical to the 1964 competition. Nothing, they play exactly the same scores and they play exactly the same way. And people will argue and say, well, there's fine nuance. Well, sure, they play in beautiful ways. They have incredible technique and they play with incredible phrasing and musicality and tone colors, but they fundamentally play exactly what's written. And if you're learning fixed dose, it's very good for that. And, teaches you to read a fixed G clef and a bass clef very, very well. So if you just want to be a modern musician playing from scores, fine. That's what it was always intended to do, by the way. Back in the mid-18th century, the fixed dose system, when it sort of came into its own, in roughly the 1750s in France, where it was primarily a method for teaching amateurs to learn to read music, because there was a new music publishing industry. So they're publishing all this music, and there's got to be an easy way for people to learn to read it. And actually, as they start to publish scores and people start to read them and make music that way, it's much easier, much easier than having an apprenticeship for 10 years. And that's why the modern systems developed, because they're for different purposes.
Great.
So that would be my answer. And when Olga says, why is it necessary for 21st century students to learn these old systems? The answer is no. But if you're, for instance, wanting to improvise in historical music, or if you're interested in early music and the whole history, the whole idea of it and how it was conceived and how these musicians in the past thought, then it is quite interesting. If you're wanting to improvise and compose in these early styles, then my opinion would be the more you can know about how things were done in the past, the better. You know, it makes it easier, makes it more comprehensible. But if you want to be a modern musician and you're just playing from scores very, very well, very, very effectively with great technique, you don't need to know these things. So they're curiosities in a way, but for some people, they want to bring these back to life. And for other people, they're just historical curiosities. And that's fine. Everybody has their own, way of using this information.
Great answer. Professor IJzerman, from our interview, somebody noticed that when your students were singing, they were not singing the hexachordal. They were using movable do, and they had a C in the seventh scale degree. So Angela wants to ask, why wasn't your students singing in the hexachordal solfeggio in that example?
As you could hear from me, I do actually a lot of hexachordal solmization, but mainly for early music students. I don't think that if you are singing melodies in the style of Hindemith or so, that hexachord solmization helps you so much. So what I did in the past, in the close past, I did a movable do with my students, with T as the seventh note, not C but T. Very important. So most of my classes are filled with violinist or trombonist or whatsoever. So I don't want to bother them with those old systems, actually. So that's the reason why. So my book that I'm using, so my harmony counterpoint partimento book, is a sort of alternative for harmony and not so much for solfeggio, of course. But that's also based on old systems. But I think that you can broaden the scope toward at least the middle of the 19th century. So, for instance, I think that Wagner can be treated very well in terms of basso continuo, partimento, and these kind of things. And therefore, you don't need Roman numerals. And so the system based on partimento and basso continuo is much more universal than the old solfeggio system, I think. That's the reason why.
Okay, great response. And here's another question. With Rebecca is asking a question now. Let me just bring it up. Professor Ventura, maybe you could take a look at this one. Let me just go back to the questions here. So my work is with pre-collegiate students aged 5 to 18. We have so much to cover in a half-hour lesson. So what simple concepts would you introduce in that context in just a half hour? I need to keep it so they won't be confused in their school music classes, which in North America is typically movable do. So far, I've had some success with 2- and 3-part cadences. Professor Ventura, what do you think about that? Some advice?
Yeah, I think the best thing to do is just to sing a lot. I sing a lot with my hand, so just make them sing on a scale and learn teach them the scales. in minor and major. If they're young, that's a great way to start. If you want to go up, I use my other hand like that. But and I think the idea to start with cadences is great. It's a very good idea because it also helps students to orientate in music listening and to enjoy music of all kinds of styles, to hear the form in music. It's very important for theory classes to become enthusiastic for the music. The love of music is, I think, central for theory classes. So listening to very good music and very good recordings by very good musicians, I think, is a central part of, at least for my teaching, very important. And I think what she already proposes sounds very good.
Great.
May I add something to that?
Absolutely, yeah.
I had some contact with a Spanish colleague of mine, and he was teaching for teenagers. And he wrote me that those little boys and girls, that they used my book. They couldn't read it because it was in English, and he regretted that there was not a Spanish translation to that. But they could make the exercises, and as you probably know, it starts very easily with 2 parts, and you don't need so many pianistic skills to already try something. And he told me that those boys and girls, after their lessons, went home and they were improvising on the simple exercises that they did in the class, and they improvised. They made some little compositions, and so according to my colleague, that was a sort of, how do you say that, start of creativity, actually, musical creativity, but just doing. And of course, nobody cares when they don't follow the rules or something like that, but just doing and trying and enjoying, actually.
Very good. Huh?
That's great. That's great. And we just have 4 more questions. Oh, yeah. Professor Gjerdingen, you wanted to add something.
Oh, well, just thinking about teaching youngsters and solfeggio, it's worth noting. I mean, oftentimes people only look at the first couple of pages of a solfeggio book, and the last pages remain a mystery. But you were going to download the 4th volume of Batiste. It's okay if you didn't, but I'll just say that the 5th volume is all duets and trios, and the Solfège d'Italie, which was the great French collection of Italian solfeggi, its 3rd and final volume is all duets. And so some of those duets are actually fugues. So solfeggio covered a lot of things. And one of the things it covered was interaction between the students, the give and take of duets as they sang back and forth with each other. And I think students enjoy that.
Great. No, great. And so I just wanted to bring up a couple more questions. This is related to Bach. And so I think it would be a good one here, which is, let's bring this up on the screen here. Many Bach keyboard pieces have very dense melodic material. Perhaps maybe we could just a quick analysis of maybe the first movement of the French suite. Wills is mentioning that he's convinced that he might have understood music precisely in the hexachordal tradition. Although his music is extremely complex, the mi-fa concept opens up his music for better understanding, and his quote, mi fa et fa mi est toda musica. I think it would be helpful for people to see these masters show the way they would understand a Bach keyboard piece. Professor Baragwanath, should we talk about this Bach piece here? Let me pull up the thing that you sent me.
Yeah, here's one we prepared earlier. Yeah, I saw this question a little while before we were talking, and so I very quickly pieced this together. And here we have BWV 815, the French suite, the Allemande in E-flat. And I have analysed it for you. And it's really obvious what Bach was doing here. It's extremely obvious. I don't have a keyboard in front of me, otherwise I would play it for you. But this is the pattern. You can see at the beginning we have Bob Gjerdingen's quiescenza schema. And in solfeggio terms, we have sol, fa, mi, sol, fa, or sol, fa, mi, fa. That's the essence of the quiescenza. Over a pedal note is a very typical example here. And you can see we've got that kind of rising thirds pattern. We've got an inganno in the first bar. The sol is actually B flat rather than what you would expect. And you can see we've got the rising through the hexachord and then descending through the hexachord. Sol, fa, mi, re, do. Very simple pattern. And if you look at the bass, you can see it's just an octave scale. Just an octave scale, rising from E flat to E flat. And then we have a staggered ascent. So I'll sing it for you. Sol, fa, mi, sol, fa, la, sol, fa. And then you'd expect it to go back to la there to finish the hexachord, but instead it goes up to sol, fa, mi, re, do, cadence. Fa, la, sol, fa, mi, la, sol, fa, mi, re, do. You can see the little staggered ascent from fa to sol. It goes up. It's a really simple pattern. And if you, I don't know if you can see it there because we can't see the bottom, bottom of the picture.
Oh, up here. Let's
the
see
bottom's missing of the picture. Go back a bit. Yeah. Look, you can see there a nice little bass pattern that Bach's used. Mi, fa, mi, fa, mi, fa. All the way down. So it teaches you all sorts of improvisation skills. Yeah. And the thing is, if you gave a partimentist this rising octave scale, even with that rhythm, they probably wouldn't do what Bach has done here. So this is actually a very advanced way of realizing an ascending scale.
Right.
Like I said, I wish I could play it for you. I don't have a keyboard.
Did Bach know this hexachordal system?
For sure. Absolutely for sure. Yes. We know contemporaries of his at the time who wrote about it and talked about it. And it was taught. It was the main system that was taught. We know the textbooks that were used during Bach's lifetime in that part of Germany. And yes, that's exactly what they used. And I think it explains a lot. And the thing is, so when I showed that example, you can see really quite simple scale patterns and scales, leaps, cadences. That's the three things you find. And the art of it is how it's spoken. Now, I use that analogy. So I like Bob, I think that music was an art of rhetoric. It's a way of speaking. So if I was a beginner, I would sing it exactly as it's written here. If I was a sort of 6-year-old, learning music, I would sing sol, fa, mi, yep, and I would learn the notes. But if I'm a master, if I start to go more advanced, I wouldn't sing them in this boring way. I would sing or play them in a different way. And Bach in this Allemande, of course, has all sorts of semiquaver figurations going on. But once you know this pattern, you can easily perceive it. Anyone, I'm sure, can hear this pattern when you hear the music. But Bach was a master. And so when he speaks these syllables, he speaks them in a wonderful stylistic way. He puts suspensions in. He messes around with the rhythm. He puts all sorts of lovely figurations and beautiful melodic turns. But the essence is the same. So a 7-year-old would be playing this, yes? The same patterns. But they can't play them like Bach played them. So it's exactly what Bob said. You start with simple things and then you vary them and you speak them over and over in different ways and you learn different styles. So this pattern could be in a 3/4 minuet style. It could be in an aria style. It could be in an adagio. It could be an allegro. It's the same pattern and you learn all the different ways you can say this. So partimentists love to improvise preludes like Bach and it's wonderful. I would say that learning the solfeggio gives you an extra dimension. It's a dimension that enhances the ability to perform bass lines like this. Great. So yes, even a complex Allemande by Bach, there are very, very simple solfeggio patterns in the melody that they have to go with the bass. You can't think of it in isolation. These are bass melody pairings, and that's kind of crucial to the style of the 18th century, as we're thankful to Bob for pointing out in his Galant style book and other publications.
Great. Well, time is really flying. We don't have much time. Just three short questions. And maybe this could be a good one for you, Professor Van Toor, but anyone can, of course, jump in. So this is a question by Derek David, and he's teaching a theory course, which is, it's wonderful. I'm just reading the whole paragraph. He's talking about how he's weaving partimento, and he's reading the Solfeggio tradition. He's really enjoying it. And his question would be, one question, what fundamental elements of the solfeggio / tetrachordal / hexachordal practice they would feel is the most important to adapt into the foundations of a course like this? So we have to take into account this is now a teacher. How can we help him integrate all this information into theory courses now?
Yeah, it's difficult to answer this, but also to react on what Nicholas just said. One thing that I've noticed in solfeggio, also with respect to Bach and the contrapuntal complexity of Bach's music, when you see Neapolitan teachers teach contrapuntal, imitational, complex, canonical stuff, they do that with solfeggi. So they do many things with just two voices and learning the students to adapt to these formulas that are used over and over again. And these are used by Bach too. It's the same stuff. So these things that were used in Italy are also used in Germany and in France. So there are many overlaps. So I think the learning solfeggio and looking at these patterns that you see in many of the, especially the old-fashioned solfeggi, where they use a lot of contrapuntal skills. There are so many overlaps with Bach's music, and it's just amazing to I learned a lot from Nicholas' book, just to see how these patterns are, how you can notice them in solfeggi, and how you can use them in your own creative work in a harmony class or in a counterpoint class. It's really, really useful.
Great. Maybe Professor Gjerdingen, let me ask you this question by Eric. His question here is referring to how are these old methods contrastable with perhaps the systems that modern players use now, Roman numeral theory, jazz theory. I think it's interesting that these systems really stand in stark contrast to what a lot of young college students, students who are younger, it's so different. And I can speak for myself, it's just totally different. I went to a very good contemporary music school. I learned jazz theory. Are these systems comparable? And in what ways can we compare and contrast these old systems with modern systems today?
Well, to call Roman numeral theory a theory, I think is an overstatement. It's a system to allow amateurs to label things that they don't understand. And after 2 years of that, we allow them to progress to more interesting classes. But, it was never designed to create professional musicians. That is not the origin. I mean, the people who invented Roman numerals in the late 18th and most of the 19th century were dealing with classes of dilettantes and amateurs. And Wagner's name came up. Okay, Wagner's real harmony teacher was Christian Weinlich, who was a teacher of Stanislaw Mattei in Bologna. That he was the protege of Padre Martini. I mean, that's how Wagner learned to move notes around, and he was quite a good contrapuntist. Richter, who wrote maybe the most important mid-19th century German harmony book, had the same teacher, Christian Weinlich. So he knew harmony, but then he came up with a Roman numeral version of it to teach to young upper-class German men in the university. And that's not the same as teaching in a music school. Now, unfortunately, Even Juilliard teaches Roman numerals now. Even Curtis. There's no alternative. But, you know, teaching Roman numerals, it would be a little like teaching a course in film criticism. And you could pass the class if you marked how many heads were on the screen at any one moment. You would say, now it's a 2-shot. Now it's a 1-shot. Now it's a crowd shot. Okay, so now you've finished and you pass. But what do you really know about making movies? So it's the same kind of thing. Partimenti and what was done in the conservatories, that was designed to teach people to be musicians, working musicians, feeding their families. Roman numerals were designed to help upper-class dilettantes pass the course in 14 weeks. There's a world of difference between those two things. Okay, that's enough to say about it.
Now, Professor Gjerdingen, it finally loaded the Baptiste book 4. Which page do you want me to go to?
Well, let's just take a look at the beginning. Can you hear my keyboard?
Yes, I can hear it. Yeah.
Okay, so we have a little cadential progression. Somewhat like the beginning of the Jupiter Symphony. Okay, then we have a double cadence, basically. Then we have a monte. And then another cadence. Okay, now come 57 variations, and you have to sing every one. When you finish this, you'll never forget this lesson. It's just part of you. It goes on for 40 pages. Then you have a fugue prelude that uses the monte pattern that you just learned, and then you start a fugue. And this is solfeggio.
57 variations. It's astonishing. That's a good education.
That's how many, let's see, I think Heinz puts 57 varieties on their ketchup bottle. But it's an amazing exercise. It's worth remembering how intense this training was. And of course, this was for 10, 11, 12-year-olds at the Paris Conservatory. And so they got wonderful training in this kind of stuff. In a later book, I show a comparison of Claude Debussy and Gabriel Pierné, both realizing the same harmony exercise. And oddly enough, Debussy was better at recognizing the Italian schemas in the exercise. I mean, they really learned these things.
Right.
Now, they went off and did truly original music, but it was on a tremendous foundation.
Great. Now we have the last question. I want to give it to Professor IJzerman, and thank you to all the people who are asking questions. I really appreciate you sending in your questions. It's been so much fun. This question is, and Professor IJzerman, you're so experienced in the classroom, and this is kind of like if the old conservatories wouldn't let their students play partimento or even instruments after years of singing, should we be focusing more on solfeggio first instead of partimento as well, or maybe before all of these instrumental studies? Shouldn't the focus be on solfeggio right at the beginning?
Yeah, when we are talking about little children, then yes, indeed, they should start to sing. And I would say preferably in choirs, little children choirs, not per se in psalmization or so, but just singing. I think that's the very best preparation for anything what you want to do in music. And the rest can wait. I would say first start singing and then take the violin or so. And don't even think of music theory before you already know how to use your voice. So the answer is yes. Let's start with singing. If the question is focusing on should we first start with with hexachord solmization instead of with partimento, I don't know. I think there are two different coins of one and the same, two different sides of one and the same coin, actually. So they have their value when you mix them. But once more, let's all start with singing, and on primary schools, the younger the better.
Great, great. And I want to leave the last word to you, Professor Baragwanath. Your book is really a tremendous book, the Solfeggio tradition. I really encourage people to look at this book. Why don't we just end off with just a final comment on Solfeggio, the hexachordal approach? And you really did answer it, I mean, multiple times in this interview. But what would you like to see with this old system in the modern age in education? And do you think it has legs in our modern conservatories and even ages 5 to 18? Can you see applications of the old Neapolitan system in modern education?
Well, I can see many applications, but what I haven't really advocated is that we should go back and the society's moved on. We've got to remember, back in the 18th century, this was a profession, and it was a profession for people who didn't have many other options. If you were a child in a conservatorio, in an orphanage, or you're born into a musical family, it's like being born into a family of electricians or plumbers, in those days. It was your trade, and you had to learn it. And you learned it with maybe 10 years of unpaid study with a master. Now, we can't go back to that. We wouldn't want to. So, no, I wouldn't say we should grab children at the age of 7 and then tell them for 10 years to go through this kind of apprenticeship, because we don't need those musicians anymore. We have scores, we have technology, we have all sorts of ways now we can create music. Back in the 18th century, they didn't have that. They needed people who could do this. And I would say, I would agree with Giorgio Sanguinetti, who once said that this was probably the most effective music education system ever devised. It was devised over centuries. It's a very special thing in European culture, I think, because it's hundreds and hundreds of years old. It goes back, all the way back to, the year 1000 or before. And it developed with an unbroken lineage through Palestrina, through Mozart. It's a wonderful, wonderful tradition and way of learning music. And I think Bob summarized its essence really well with that example from Cherubini, where you learn a simple pattern and you learn to say it in a different way. And you learn it and you keep doing it until you can speak it, until it's no longer something you read, it's something you can actually speak. So I wouldn't presume to tell people nowadays how they might use this information. I think that actually there are people who are much better qualified than me to put it into their own practice if it helps them. And I'm also not prescriptive over how it should be taught. If people find it helps, I like the way Job taught it, for instance, because Job taught it to early music students as part of their education on early music. And some students, I imagine, really took to it and thought, oh, this is great, I can learn to improvise. Singers and so on might think of that. Other musicians might think, well, it's quite interesting, or it's a curiosity, but it's not really going to be helping me in my practice. So I think we live in a pluralist educational situation at the moment. And I would say that it's just one more thing that's of interest. What I would say at the end, though, just to finish off, is that I think now, and I don't want to be sort of too presumptuous here, but I think now there isn't really any doubt that it was part of the fundamentals of music back in the 18th, 17th, 16th centuries. This was a way that music was taught and studied. And so if we are to understand that music, if you want to presume to tell people you know how to perform this music or you know how to describe it or interpret it, I do think it is part of the mix now. I do think that you can't really claim to be a performer in a historically authentic style or whatever without at least knowing of this. So it is part of the mix. It's part of history, and it should be considered, an integral part of our understanding of music of this period. And personally, I think, as I say, we've got over 1,000 years of development of wonderful musical history, and there's so much to discover. And it's just one part of that. It's a part of that which is a fairly essential way of understanding something of what they did in the past. There are many other ways too, and many other things that are of interest historically. So yeah, Nikhil, On behalf of all of us, I'm sure we'll all say thank you so much for inviting us.
Yes, absolutely.
Wonderful experience and a really interesting. It's been fascinating for me to hear the others actually speaking.
Well, thank you so much to the panelists, and thank you for sending in the questions. It's been a real pleasure, and I know that this is just the beginning of the research in this area, and I'm looking forward to more fantastic research and more publications. And thank you so much to the panelists. There will be more Solfeggio and more Partimento for the rest of the year. Thank you to everyone. Bye bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.